Well, I know Guadalcanal is in the title, but it's more about other things that took place that made the victory in Guadalcanal and some of the other battlefields in this part of the Pacific possible. It's one of those things you're not going to find any books written about unless you dig really hard because they're probably rather obscure. Certainly no movies were made about things like supply and support. But I put it another way, for every soldier and Marine who was in the field and for every plane that was in the air and every ship on the sea, there was a whole lot of people in the background that you're never probably going to know about unless they were your fathers or your grandfathers, because we're talking about people working in the coal mines, working in the factories to produce the steel and the aluminum that then is turned into ships and planes and other material with which to conduct the war. And even though it's not very dramatic or romantic or exciting, it was certainly a part of the process of conducting the war. And I'm going to start off with some maps so we can get you oriented as to the area we're talking about. We'll talk about a big map first, and that little blue arrow is pointing towards the area that I'm going to discuss today. And it's not a very big area if you look at the Pacific, but right down here is New Caledonia, and then up just to the north of that is the New Hebrides, better known as Vanuatu today. Now here's a little bit closer map. You can see New Caledonia, which is still a French colony, and then just to the north is the New Hebrides. And this is where the Allies moved in right away, the Australians and New Zealanders, and then especially the Americans, because they wanted to seize those before the Japanese. Because we know that the Japanese plan, knowing that they couldn't take Australia or New Zealand, at the very least they wanted to seize Port Moresby there in the south end of Papua New Guinea. If that was successful, then they were going to seize New Caledonia, then Fiji further to the east, and then Samoa, which is off the map. Of course, none of that came to pass. So they sent an entire U.S. Army division into New Caledonia right away. It was called the AmeriCal Division. Ameri for American, Cal for Caledonia. And they were supposed to be there in case the Japanese did attempt to take the place. So this is one big theater: Papua New Guinea, the Solomon Islands, New Caledonia, and the New Hebrides. And I'm going to get another map so you get a pretty good idea as to what the Solomon Islands look like. And of course, the Marines didn't land in Guadalcanal until the first week of August of 1942. And this is after the Battle of Coral Sea and after the Battle of Midway. And here's a little closer up. Now, the main base, even though we had facilities on New Caledonia and also in Ifate, which is one of the further south in the New Hebrides, the main base that was really built up was in Espiritu Santo. That's the biggest island up there to the north, because it was 400 miles closer to Guadalcanal than Ifite, which was further south down there. I might also point out, though, that almost all the bases that were built in Espiritu Santo were on the east side, because that's where all the flat ground is. If you go farther to the west, it's very mountainous, very jungly. As a matter of fact, when I was there some years ago doing some of my initial research on what happened there, I met a guy from Australia who was involved in fisheries, and a lot of the fisheries is on the west side of the island. And there's only a few villages there, and he said one time when they went inland into the hills just to explore, there were some villages up there, but they were so cut off that when they saw strangers come, they all headed for the bush. And this is just in recent years. So a little bit about the history. Both the British and the French had interest there, although they weren't really extensive. And the French were more involved in New Caledonia because that's where one of the main sources of nickel in the world is found, even to this very day. But for whatever reason, in 1906, the British and the French decided they were going to govern the New Hebrides equally. And the British and French have a long history of not liking each other. I mean, they were constantly at war over the centuries, especially after the Roman Empire dissolved and the Romans retreated back across the Apennine Mountains. The British and the French were always at each other's throat until the Germans came along and they decided, well, maybe we should be friends because we got the Germans here to deal with. But for whatever reason, they decided they were going to govern the New Hebrides themselves. And if you can imagine, they had two separate education systems, the British and French education. They had two different police forces. They had two different judiciary systems. And even when I was there just a few years ago, I met people who could speak both French and English. And I met people who went through a French education system and others who went through the British education system. For whatever reason, I guess they adapted and it seemed to work okay. But this is before the Battle of Coral Sea, which was in May 1942, and before Midway, which was a month later. But Roosevelt was already, in lieu with his Joint Chiefs of Staff who were doing all the planning for how the war would be conducted, not only in the Pacific, but in other parts of the world. And this was the pronouncement that President Roosevelt made as early as March 1942. This is only a few months after Pearl Harbor. It was hold Hawaii, support Australasia, and drive north from the New Hebrides. So this is already in the planning. Now, this is Admiral Gromley. He was an Annapolis graduate. He was a good friend of Admiral Nimitz, and he was one of his lieutenants because the Pacific Theater was so big that even though he had overall command of the Pacific, he had a lieutenant who covered the North Pacific and one of his lieutenants who covered the South Pacific, and he had overall command of the Central Pacific, but he wasn't really going to do much until he had the wherewithal to conduct operations in the Central Pacific. Namely, the first landings there would be in Tarawa in November 1943. But in the meantime, they wanted to take the war to the Japanese in the Solomon Islands. And Admiral Gormley, who originally his base was in Auckland, California, he was very skeptical about the plans for taking Guadalcanal. He just didn't think that we could have the overall, the manpower and everything else necessary to make it a success. At one stage, after the Marines had landed in Guadalcanal and had secured a foothold there at least, Nimitz actually came out to the South Pacific on a little inspection tour, and one of the things he did was stop to see Admiral Gormley, who by this time had moved his headquarters up to New Caledonia, and he had pretty much came to the conclusion that Gormley was burnt out. Not only burnt out, he was skeptical about the operation going on, and he figured he needed somebody in there who had more of a fighting reputation and was not afraid to take a chance. So he relieved Gormley. He was sent off to England at some desk job over there, and he was replaced by Admiral Halsey. And Admiral Halsey was not afraid to mix it up, so he turned out to be the right commander at the right time in the right place. This is Admiral John McCain. He was in charge of the Land Sea Air Command on Espiritu Santo, and I'll just refer to it as Santo from now. That's what the natives call it. His son was also an Annapolis graduate, and he served in the Pacific and the Navy during World War II. And then most of you know about his grandson, who was also an Annapolis graduate. He was a carrier pilot. He was shot down over North Vietnam during the Vietnam War. I think he spent about 6 years there as a prisoner of war. Once they got it built up, it was sort of a staging area for not only heavy bombers, but fighter planes, ships, and I'll go into that in more detail. But they had the 11 bombardment group, which is B-17 Flying Fortresses. Now, I'm sure most of you're probably close to my generation. You remember Gene Roddenberry, right? He did the series Star Trek that was very popular when I was a college student. I never watched it. I was not that fascinated by it myself. But he was a B-17 pilot, and he flew out of Espiritu Santos. As a matter of fact, he crashed his B-17. They say it was because of mechanical failure. After the war, he flew for American Airlines for a while, but he was very much involved in script writing for TV and movies. And then he came up with this TV series called Star Trek. Now, there was it's very interesting, the race relations, because the U.S. military was segregated, and most of the people on these islands were Melanesians. In other words, they were just as black as African Americans, and they were more or less treated like indentured servants, because there were only a limited number of British, French, and maybe a few Australian planters there. And the Melanesians were used as manual labor, but they weren't as hard-working, I guess, as some of the French and the British thought they should be, so they brought in Vietnamese, because Vietnam was under the French at that time, to work on the plantations. The plantations, for the most part, were copra plantations, in other words, coconut. But with the African American troops there, the locals, the Melanesians, thought that they had a different system in the U.S. military, because they saw African Americans and Caucasians working together, eating together in the same mess tents, and they thought, well, these Americans are a little bit different than the British and the French, because they treat each other as equals. Of course, they didn't know all the story behind race relations in the U.S. military at the time, but they saw it differently than it actually was. And some of the people I talked to there said, well, the Americans, they would even let us come and eat in their mess tents. They would hire us away from the plantations, because they needed laborers to help build up the infrastructure in the islands. And they paid them better than the French and the British did. And the British had almost total control over these people. They had to stay on the plantations, and they couldn't leave unless they got special permission from their overseers. But when the Americans came along and offered them better pay, and offered them food, and they even gave them clothing, they thought this was heaven on earth. And this is what they see. They saw black Seabees. And 50 to 70% of the U.S. military personnel on Espiritu Santos, and as well as New Caledonia, were African Americans. They were African American Seabees. And then this gives you an idea. Here's Caucasians and blacks working together, even though it was supposed to be a segregated military. Now, what about women? Well, about the only women on the island were nurses. Okay, and when they weren't on duty, they had their own special compound, and it was fenced off, and they had guards 24 hours a day, because there's a whole lot of guys there and very few women. As far as native women are concerned, well, the local man had the bright idea of taking all the women between 16 and 60 and moving them on to a little island off the coast, and asked the military to declare it out of bounds. So, if you can imagine, there are just hundreds of thousands of Americans and Australians and New Zealanders there, and the only women around were nurses, and they were under heavy guard. But in the 1930s, there were fewer than 1,500 Europeans there, and they were mostly administrators and, like I said, plantation owners, and there were approximately 40,000 natives, but there was no infrastructure. There were no roads. I don't think there was even any electricity on the islands. But when they came in, for example, when we first moved into Espiritu Santos, they had to offload the ships onto lighters and then move the lighters over to the beach and offload them until they could build docking facilities, warehouses, and everything else they needed. So basically, the Seabees were in civilian life. They were tradesmen. Okay, they were builders. They were heavy equipment operators, plumbers, electricians, everything that you would have in your own hometowns. They'd literally pick them up, made them part of the military, and sent them all over the world to construct airstrips and other facilities in order to carry the war to the Japanese. And this is just an overview of what it looked like, at least partly through the effort to build an infrastructure onto the islands. They built tank farms for both AV gas and bunker fuel for the ships. I haven't been drinking, I promise. It's just the ship moving. I'll have a drink later. They had repair shops. So all the vehicles, you had spare tires, you had spare parts, repairs were made. They had plumbers. They built over 3,000 Quonset huts, over 200 miles of roads on Santo alone. And we have to remember that the base facilities were, for the most part, on a limited part of the island, namely on the east coast. And they built floating dry docks. I mentioned Seattle Harbor. When they took the Admiralty Islands, they had 2 floating dry docks that they had built in sections on the west coast of the U.S., and they used tugs to bring them out there. Then they welded them together to make them workable out there. And they had a bombing range. This is Espiritu Santos, and this little tiny island just off the east coast is a place called Mafia Island, and they used it for a practice range for the pilots when they came through. Before they actually went off to combat in the Solomons, they would get some training there, bombing practice, strafing practice. And I got permission from the chief of Mafia Island to actually go out there. And we just got in a little outboard motor, and that's how close it was to the main island. We went out there. This is one of the fighter strips that was nearby. They also had 3 bomber fields out there. That's how big it was. It was really quite humongous. And it was all built really within the matter of months of the Seabees getting there. They were just working around the clock to get this up because they needed this facility in order to help support the fighting in Guadalcanal. And then later, other parts of the Solomon Islands after the Japanese pulled out of Guadalcanal. But I got over to Mafia Island, and I have a friend in Auckland. His name is Ewan Stevenson. He was born and raised on Guadalcanal. His father was an administrator out there before the Solomon Islands gained their independence. So he grew up out there, and so he spent his childhood roaming around a Pacific War battlefield. He just became so obsessed with it. He's still obsessed. He's in his 50s. He probably knows more about the Solomon Islands than anybody else. I mean, he's a diver. He's dived a lot of the wrecks on Iron Bottom Sound and other parts of the Solomons. He's also discovered aircraft wreck sites, not only in the water, but in the jungle. He's been working actively with DPAA, if you remember that from my lecture on the missing in action from the Pacific War. That's the POW-MIA Accounting Command out of Honolulu. But I was telling him about my interest in Vanuatu. And so he got interested too, and he started doing some research, and he got back to me, and he put together a list of over 400 aircraft that went missing just in the greater Vanuatu area. And this was a non-combat zone. In other words, all those aircraft that went down there were operational losses. They had nothing to do with the war. I think this was typical throughout the Pacific. Most of the aircraft and the air crews that we lost, especially in the Pacific during World War II, were non-combat related. And so I had access to some of these wreck sites. I found they took me out to, when they found out I was a Pacific War historian, they gave me the VIP treatment, and they just assigned somebody to show me everything they could while I was there. They showed me a B-17 crash site. They showed me a P-38 crash site. And then when I found out that Mafia was being used as a bombing and strafing range, I got permission from the chief to go out there. And this is one of the sites they showed me. This is the remains of an F-4U Corsair. Now, some of the problems that pilots had when they're strafing for target practice or in real combat, they wanted to see where their bullets hit, and they would forget to pull out. And that's what happened to this Corsair. It went right into the ground. I saw the wings. I saw the 650 caliber machine guns. A DPA was notified about this years ago and came out and identified the site. I don't know if they pulled human remains out of there or not. And then I had to hike a little bit further around the island to the next crash site. And this is not like a big island with big mountains, but there's just a few rocky outcrops. But here's a plane. I don't even know what kind of plane of it, because this is all that's left of it is the prop and the nose gear. Whatever he was doing, strafing or bombing, he didn't pull out. He went right into the side of this rock, and that's about all there is left of it. I think they grew coffee out there at one time because the locals who live out there They said there's coffee bushes all throughout the island, and they don't even have to cultivate it. They go out and harvest it if they want a little bit of extra spending money. And this, I was told, was a holding cell for Japanese POWs who had been captured in Solomon Island, captured on Guadalcanal, or maybe some of the other islands, and they were held there temporarily until they could be sent to one of two POW camps. One was in Australia and one was in New Zealand. And in both cases, the Japanese rioted and tried to break out. And a lot of them were killed in the process. And in New Zealand, though, no New Zealanders were killed during the breakout, but in Australia, some of the Australian soldiers who were guarding them ended up as casualties. I might also add, this is where a Chinese construction company had their base. I used to go to a kava bar there and drink kava with some of the Chinese construction workers. What they were supposedly doing at the time was building a new cruise ship terminal there in Espiritu Santo. But after they got it built, they said, well, we'd like to put some of our warships here instead of cruise ships. Now, the last I heard, somebody from the State Department went out there and had a serious conversation with the president of Vanuatu. And as far as I know, there are no Chinese ships based there at the moment. At the moment. It's a cruise ship terminal. Now, this is the USS President Coolidge. It was a troop ship. It was a civilian, had another purpose in civilian life before it was taken over by the Navy. What the Americans did, though, around the channel that led in there, they laid minefields because they didn't want Japanese ships or submarines coming in there. And somebody forgot to tell the captain of the Coolidge that they had a minefield out there. So he came into the harbor, he hit two of them, and the captain had a good sense, though, to run the ship up onto a reef, and it stayed there long enough for most of the soldiers to get off. All they had to do was just go down the side of the ship and wade the rest of the shore, but not long after that, the ship slipped off the reef down into deep water. But there were still a few people on there. I think there were a few people in the sick bay on the ship. And there was a Captain Elwood J., if I can read, Uger or something. I can't read it very well. But anyway, he went in there to try to rescue some of the people who are still on there, and before he could get out of the ship, it slipped off the reef, and he drowned. It was only a few years ago. They sent divers down in there, and they actually found his remains and were able to identify those remains as his using DNA. Now, here's somebody who served on Espiritu Santo. I'm sure most of you would recognize him. Future President of the United States. He was involved with the air wing element that was on Santos, and he later transferred up to Green Island, which was a small island just north of Bougainville and very close to Rabaul. It was seized by New Zealand troops of the 3rd New Zealand Division. They were taken in with U.S. ships, and they also had U.S. Seabees there, and they wanted the little green island to build a fighter strip there. So New Zealand Air Force Corsairs flew off there, as well as U.S. Marine Corps Corsairs, and other planes such as C-47s would come and go out of there. And everybody might recognize James Michener. He was a naval supply officer there on Espiritu Santos, and while he was there, he wrote his book, South Pacific. It was later turned into a stage play and then a movie, and of course, James Michener went on to write a number of other books about the South Seas and other subjects. There are a number of hospitals on there. I think there were at least 3 hospitals. They could take in hundreds of patients. Most all of them were sick and wounded. They were coming in from Guadalcanal, and then later some of the other battles that took place in that area. And they had USO troops that came out here, and if you might recognize Bob Hope there, and Jerry Colon, I think, is just to the left of him there. They came out not only there, but other parts of the Pacific, as I think a lot of you know, trying to entertain the troops on some of these distant Pacific islands. Also, Eleanor Roosevelt, she was more or less considered the eyes and ears of President Roosevelt. They'd been estranged for a number of years, going back to the time when Eleanor Roosevelt discovered her husband was having an affair with her secretary. What was her name, Lucy Mercer or something like that anyway. But regardless, she still served a purpose as being the First Lady. And since President Roosevelt was paraplegic, he would always send her out to see what was going on in various theaters, especially in the Pacific. So she'd go out and let the president know how the morale of the troops were. She would stop and at hospitals and talk to some of the wounded, take their names and addresses. She'd write personal letters back to their families, letting them know that she had talked to their son and he was in the hospital but doing well, etc. like this. I did interview one person who was stationed in Tulagi, which is a little island just to the north of Guadalcanal, right off the coast of Florida Island. And he told me in his oral history that she came out there and they built this wooden platform and she was so she could address the troops by a microphone. At least in his oral history interview, she said something to the effect of these Marines had been out there fighting and dying and suffering from malnutrition and tropical diseases. And she said something, at least in his oral history, he said something to the effect that you should be so proud that you've been selected to come out here and die for your country. And they didn't take it very well. You can't find this in the history books. But he said they were so mad they started shooting at the wooden platform she was standing on. They had to get her the hell out of there. But like I said, this was in an oral history interview that I conducted, and I haven't been able to find it in any of the history books. And I doubt that they wanted to publicize that during the war. So this is Pappy Boynton. Some of you may have heard of him. He was a Marine Corps fighter pilot. He fought in China before Pearl Harbor with the Flying Tigers. But then after Pearl Harbor, a lot of these guys came back and served in either the Army Air Force or the Navy or Marine Corps. So he was flying F-4U Corsairs. He flew out of Espiritu Santo originally. But then when they seized Green Island to the north of Bougainville, like I said, they had a New Zealand Air Force squadron flying F-4Us, and they also had a Marine Corps squadron up there flying F-4Us. And he flew out of Green Island when they were trying to reduce Rabaul. They were going out there and bombing it and engaging in dogfights with the fighters that were there. It was like just going on day after day after day until the Japanese realized that they were being cut off and that there was really no hope for keeping their planes and their ships there. But before they pulled all their fighter planes out, he was engaged in any number of dogfights there. And in his last dogfight, he got shot down and was captured. He was lucky because they didn't execute him. As the story goes, they had a Nisei there. He was a Japanese and American who ended up in Japan and had been drafted into the military, and he was stuck on Rabaul, and he was using Pappy Boynton and a couple of other American pilots that had been shot down. He says, these people have really important information that I need to get back to Tokyo. He says, so he used that as an excuse, and Boynton and a couple other guys to get both him and these pilots out of Rabaul back to Japan. I thought it was a pretty interesting scheme. But either way, he spent the rest of the war as a POW in Japan. He lived not too far from me in California when I lived there. And I had interviewed a former Marine Corps fighter pilot who also served out there during the war. And they would have these regular get-togethers back in the 1990s and early 2000s. And he was part of this group that would get together. But this other Marine Corps pilot told me that eventually they had to stop inviting him to these reunions because he had become an alcoholic. And when he got drunk, he got really obnoxious. To the point that he had become a bit of an embarrassment to some of the others. Now, this is million dollar point, because like I said, we built up this infrastructure. It was like a little American city. Everything that you would find in your hometowns, they had constructed in Espiritu Santo, but at the end of the war, they just left a lot of stuff on these islands. Now, they had all these trucks, these jeeps, they had bulldozers, they had other heavy equipment, and this there's a number of stories. One of them was they didn't want to take it back. Number one, they thought it would disrupt the civilian economy after the war was over. If they had all these trucks and jeeps and bulldozers coming back, it would slow down the process of getting the economy back on a civilian footing. And so they offered to sell all this equipment to some of the European planters there. You know, you get a Jeep for $200, something like that. I don't know how much they were going to charge you for a bulldozer, but it was like almost a giveaway. But these guys were so selfish. They say, well, no, we don't want to buy that stuff from you, thinking that, well, if we don't buy it, they're going to leave it here anyway. We'll get it for free. So what the U.S. military decided to do, well, we'll show you. And they actually built a pier out into the ocean. And they drove all these trucks and bulldozers and jeeps and they drove it right off the end of the pier into the deep water. And now it's a favorite diving site. People go out there to dive $1 Million Point. They also go out there to dive the USS Coolidge. It's very popular for scuba divers. Now, of course, as an historian, I always asking questions, all these what-if questions. And what if the Japanese had gotten there first? Huh? Well, there was a possibility that might happen. That's why we sent an entire army division to New Caledonia to keep them from taking that. And if they had taken it, the war might have taken a completely different turn. And what if the Allies had lost Guadalcanal? Another what-if. And the effects of the war had on the local population, the cargo cult, and other things like that, because life was not going to be the same, especially for the planters, and especially for the local population, because they were treated one way by the European planters, but when the Americans came there, they treated them as equals, at least in their eyes. They saw blacks and whites working together, eating together, seeming to get along quite well. And they thought, well, we're not going to go back to the old ways. We're not going to go work out on the plantation for pennies and have to request permission if we wanted to leave and go into town. And of course, now, look what they had. I mean, they had electricity, they had roads, and they had all these Quonset huts left over. And you go out to Espiritu Santos now, there's still Quonset huts that are still there, and they're still being used for various purposes. And one of them was the John Frun movement. It was like a religion. This guy from one of the islands out there, he started a whole religion or a cult, all because of all of the material goods too. I mean, these people had it was like the war was not a hardship on them. It was a wonderful time to exist. And they're in the process of building a museum out there. This is what they want it to look like. It's sort of it's going to look like a stylized version of the Quonset hut. Whoops, I better get back over here. Okay. Now, it hasn't been completed yet. They have a very small structure there. They have a lot of artifacts there. I've contributed some stuff to the museum. So if you ever, the cruise ships go out there, so if you ever get a chance there, and when the cruise ships go there, they're getting a lot of visitors to the museum, and even it's just a very small building at the time. So this is not one of my longer lectures. I keep wanting to get back to Espiritu Santos, especially because of my involvement with the EPA. I'd like to get out there and be involved with finding some of the crash sites out there, because like I said, over 400 aircraft went down in that area, and they've only found a small fraction of them. Some of them went down in the jungle, but a lot of them went down into the water around the island. But I'm sure very few of you know how to speak Baslama. That's sort of the Vanuatu equivalent of Pidgin English, but the big guy there, second from the right, that is the chief of Mafia Island. He's the guy that gave me permission to go out there and examine some of the wreck sites. But then Baslama, the USA, make him a good friend with Vanuatu. So, and tomorrow I'm going to be talking about Liberty ships tomorrow. And it's at 9 in the morning, so get a good night's sleep.